Hey guys, Exotic Dan here. Welcome back to another video, and in this video I am going to be doing another video in a series where I react to and learn things about Australia. So, I am on Google Maps, as you can see, and this right here is Australia. And today I am going to be learning about I'm going to be learning about how the Australian states and territories got their names. So this whole entire thing right here, this whole entire island, that is Australia. So if we head over here, we can see that Australia is actually not that far away from Canada, because right here above the United States is Canada. It's right next to Greenland as well. So yeah, it's not really that far away from Canada. So yeah, we're going to be learning a little bit about how the Australian states and territories got their names. So just looking at the map, there is really not that much I really know about their names and how they got their names, because it's not a topic that we really talk that much about here in Canada. So there's a tiny island right underneath, I guess you could say, mainland Australia, called Tasmania. There's also Victoria, but I am assuming that it has no relationship to Victoria, British Columbia. There's also New South Wales as well. There's Queensland, South Australia, Northern Territory, and then there's Western Australia. So just looking at the Australian map, I can kind of guess how maybe some of these states and territories got their names, but I also do feel like that might not be how they got their names as well. Like, to me, Northern Territory, to me, I feel like that might be like maybe the northern part of Australia, and maybe that's how it got its name. And then there's South Australia, South Australia, that possibly got its name for being in the southern part of Australia, and then maybe Western Australia for being being in the western part of Australia. And then there's New South Wales, which I have heard about, which I believe was if I'm not mistaken, I believe that was probably like maybe one of the first Australian states that was ever founded in Australia, but I could be completely wrong on that as well. But yeah, so what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be watching a video, basically seeing how the Australian states and territories got their names. So here I have a video basically explaining how the Australian states and the territories of Australia got their names. So yeah, I'm basically going to be reacting to this video and see how they got their names. So without further ado, let's take a look and see how the Australian states and territories got their names.
Australia is a federal constitutional monarchy consisting of 6 states, 3 internal territories, and 7 external territories, each with its unique name and nickname. Some of them have intriguing origins, while others are more amusing. So let's dive into what they all mean. The name of New South Wales came in 1770, when the HMS Endeavour, commanded by James Cook, was charting the unmapped eastern coast of Australia, which was then known as New Holland. Cook claimed the entire coastline as British territory, giving it the name New Wales. However, on his return journey to Britain, he changed it and settled on the now famous New South Wales, reflecting its location in the southern hemisphere. But why did he pick New Wales and not New Scotland or New Ireland or any other British place name? He was probably drawing a connection to the Prince of Wales, which was then a title held by the British heir apparent and later King George IV. And while Wales is known as Cymru in the Welsh language, meaning compatriot, its Its English name Wales comes from Walhaz, used by the Germanic tribes, which meant foreigner. New South Wales was the first state established in the country, so it's appropriately nicknamed the Premier State or the First State, as we see on some of these old license plates. The capital, Sydney, was named in 1788 by the first governor of New South Wales, Captain Arthur Phillip. He named it after the British Home Secretary Thomas Townshend, who was the first Viscount of Sydney. But Thomas's title ultimately comes from Robert Sidney, the first Earl of Leicester. But the Sidney family rose to prominence in the Tudor period, and their story is pretty cool, but their surname most likely originates from the Anglo-Saxon locational name Sidan Igi, meaning at the wide island or at the water meadow. And there's also some folk etymology stating that Sydney comes from the French place name Saint-Denis. And before all that, the Aboriginal people in the area called it Warani. Next, we have Victoria, which split from New South Wales in 1851 and got its name after, of course, Queen Victoria. Similar to
Oh, okay, so that's how it's got its name. It was named after Queen Victoria. Okay, that's interesting, actually. I honestly did not know that. So it's definitely in no close relationship to... It's definitely not in close relationship with Victoria, BC, or Victoria, British Columbia. That's not how this Victoria got its name. It was named after Queen Victoria. But it does make me wonder if the Victoria in Canada was also named after Queen Victoria. But yeah, that's pretty interesting, actually. I honestly did not know about that. That's pretty cool.
Next state, Queensland, and every other place on this map. And just like New Jersey here in the States, Victoria is nicknamed Australia's Garden State. And that's because of its fertile soil and annual rainfall. And besides the Garden State nickname, Victoria is also known as the Education State. The capital city of Melbourne was incorporated as a crown settlement in 1837, when it was named after the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, William Lamb, who was the second Viscount Melbourne. And he got that title from his father, who was made the Baron of Melbourne in England. And the name of the English town was first recorded in the famous Domesday Book as a royal manor, and it meant mill stream or the mill by the stream. Moving to Queensland, we see that the first European settlement there began in 1824 as a convict penal outpost until 1842. After that, it was open to free settlement, but it was still part of New South Wales. But the locals started petitioning to separate from the distant seat of government in Sydney, so in 1859, Queen Victoria granted them their own colony, and as the name perfectly suggests, they named it Queensland to honor her. The state later earned the nickname Sunshine State for its...
Really, that's so interesting on how Queen Victoria basically got the Australian states named, like how she got like 2 Australian states like named after her. She got named first off. She got named after Victoria, and then in Queensland, that was also named after her. That is interesting on how both Queensland and Victoria were both named after Queen Victoria. That is very interesting. I honestly had no idea that's actually how it got its name. Like if I was like to guess how Queensland got its name, I probably would have assumed that it would have like something to do with like queens or royalty. So I was definitely, I would say, if I wasn't like perfectly like spot on, I would definitely have to say that I was definitely really close.
Tropical and subtropical climate, Great Barrier Reef, and beautiful beaches, which make tourism an important part of the state's economy. And some of the license plates there show that nickname, and I found this optional one that calls it the Smart State.
The Smart State, interesting.
And it's named after the Brisbane River, which in turn was named after Sir Thomas Brisbane, who was the governor of New South Wales. And Thomas's surname means bone breaker, from the Scottish Gaelic bris, meaning to break or smash, and the Old English word ban, meaning bone. Western Australia is the largest state in the country, and the name itself says everything. The territory is situated in the western part of the country. And this state is known as the Wildflower State because of its unique biodiversity of over 12,000 different wildflower species. And it's also known as the Golden State since gold was first discovered there in 1885. And it's been a major producer of the metal ever since, and had its own California-style gold rush which grew its population. The capital was named after the city of Perth in Scotland in honor of Sir George Murray. He was the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies and a member from Perthshire in the British House of Commons. And the name for the Scottish city Perth comes from the Pictish word for wood, relating to the Welsh word for hedge or thicket. Moving to South Australia, which was named as such by the British Parliament because it's located in the southern part of the continent, although it's geographically farther up north from Victoria and Tasmania, which is similar to Canada's Northwestern Territories, not being the northernmost or the westernmost. The South Australian Association played a key role in establishing...
So there's definitely like some relationship with Australian geography and Canadian geography. So basically, South Australia is basically more northern than Victoria and Tasmania, while in Canada we have Northwest Territories, which isn't really like the northern part or even the western part of Canada. So that's interesting on how that's actually the case, and how it actually has like some familiarity with Canada's Northwest Territories. That's something that both South Australia in Australia and Northwest Territories in Canada basically have in common. They're basically not situated in like the exact like area, and they're basically like not aligned with like other, I guess you could say, states and territories and continents in that matter. So yeah, that's definitely very interesting. Like basically how he said that, of how South Australia is more northern than Victoria and Tasmania. That is very interesting, actually. I honestly did not know that. That's pretty interesting.
Colin. Check out the South Australia Act of 1834 for more information. This state, however, is nicknamed the Festival State because of its many world-class events and festivals that showcase the state's food, wine, art, and culture. And speaking of wine, it's also known as the Wine State because it's responsible for more than half the production of all Australian wine.
What? That is crazy.
The capital Adelaide was named in honor of Queen Adelaide, who was the wife of King William IV. It's essentially a feminine name of German origin that means of noble kin or noble nature. Tasmania.
So that's interesting on how basically all these festivities and how all these that's crazy on how South Australia is known as the state, is known as the festival and wine state, and that's interesting because because of all the festivities. I don't know all the festivities that happen there, but it's definitely something that I'd definitely be interested in learning about. Like, I kind of wonder like what type of festivities they have down in South Australia, and I also and while I don't really care so much about wine so much, but it's definitely interesting on how they basically produce the most of it, like more than any other state in Australia. So to me, that's kind of interesting on how it got like all those names and how it became the Australian state of festivities and wine. Like, that's kind of interesting on how that actually became the Australian state for those two things. That is very interesting, actually. I honestly had no idea about it.
That means of noble kin or noble nature. Tasmania is the only island state in Australia, and it was named after the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who made the first reported European sighting of the island on November 24, 1642.
Wow.
He himself actually named the island Anthony Van Diemen's Land, which was after the guy sponsoring him, Anthony Van Diemen, who was the governor of the Dutch East Indies. The name was later shortened to Van Diemen's Land by the British, but they eventually renamed the island Tasmania in honor of its first European discoverer in 1856. Tassie is one of the popular nicknames for the state, as well as the Apple Isle.
Tassie,
or
okay.
Holiday Isle. In
Oh, Holiday
1804,
Isle.
The settlement that developed to become the capital was named Hobart Town. or Hobarton after the British Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, Lord Hobart. And looking after the name origin for Hobart, it revealed a few variants of the classic name Hubert, which means bright or shining intellect. Moving on to the territories, we start with the Australian Capital Territory, whose creation is tied to the fierce rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. Both cities wanted to be the capital, so to avoid the conflict, a compromise was made and the capital would be a new city built between the two. And the territory's capital, Canberra, is also the Australian capital. The name Canberra is a funny one. It comes from the Nadwal Canberra, which means meeting place. But more amusing theories say that it means place between women's breasts. Why, you ask? Well, Canberra is a flat land between Mount Ainslie and Black Mountain, that's why. But during the city's planning, other names were proposed, like Aurora, Captain Cook, Kangaroo, Swindleville, Union City, Gone Broke, and many others, each funnier than the last one. But my favorite one was this one, combining names like Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, and Brisbane. The Bush Capital is one of the nicknames for Canberra.
Really? The Bush Capital?
Vast natural bushlands and nature reserves, making it more connected to nature than urban areas.
Whoa, hold up. Hold up. Trying to go back a little bit. These are actually sceneries that you could find in the Northern Territory. These are beautiful. Like, these are really, like, this is, like, these three pictures that I see right here. This is probably not all of Northern Australia, but it's definitely but these sceneries that I'm seeing, they're very beautiful, and I really like how there's, like, all this stuff here, you know? Like, Canada definitely has, like, beautiful scenery, but this is really beautiful. Like, I'm honestly blown away, like, of how beautiful this scenery is.
Urban areas. The territory's license plates, on the other hand, have the nation's capital and the heartland of the nation on them. Moving to the Northern Territory, whose name is also self-explanatory. It's nicknamed the Top End, or with its initials NT, and its own license plates call it Australia's Outback. The capital's name
Outback Australia, interesting.
During a survey by the HMS Beagle that was sailing through the local harbor. John Clements Wickham named the region Port Darwin in honor of his former shipmate Charles Darwin, who had sailed with them in the previous voyage. The first settlement there was known as Palmerston in 1869, but it was later renamed Darwin in 1911. The name Darwin itself evolved from the Old English Derwin, which means dear friend. The smallest internal territory is Jervis Bay Territory, and it was named in 1791 by Lieutenant Richard Bowen when he entered the bay in honor of Admiral John Jervis, who was a famous British Royal Navy officer, politician, and peer. The name Jervis itself, however, is a variant of the name Jarvis, which ultimately comes from an old German word meaning spear. Australia also has...
Okay, so Jervis? I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that was something I definitely did not remember seeing on the map of Australia, so that's interesting on how that was brought up. And there were some other parts of Australia that I didn't know either, so that's pretty cool actually.
Few external territories.
External territories.
So let's quickly go over them. Norfolk Island was named by James Cook on his second voyage to the South Pacific. He named it after Mary Howard, Duchess of Norfolk, who had asked him to name an island after her one day. Norfolk comes from the Old English phrase Norfolk, which means the land of the North people. Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean is next, and it takes its name from...
Christmas Island. That is interesting. I've never heard of that before.
Discovery on Christmas Day, 1643. Also in the Indian Ocean, there is the Cocos Keeling Island territory, with Cocos referring to the abundance of coconut trees that dominate the landscape, and Keeling referring to William Keeling, who discovered the islands in 1609. The surname Keeling is most likely from English origin, and is derived from a Middle English word that meant young codfish, potentially used as a nickname for a fishmonger or someone with big staring eyes. The Australian Antarctic territories, as well as the Coral Sea Island territory, are next, but both of them have obvious names, so let's skip to the last two uninhabited territories. Ashmore and Carrier Island off the Indonesian coast is the first one. Carrier Island was visited by Captain Nash in the year 1800 and named after his ship, while Ashmore Island was seen by Captain Samuel Ashmore in 1811 and named after him. The Heard Island and McDonald Islands territory were named after two American men. American sailor
McDonald Islands? Sorry, but sometimes whenever I hear McDonald Islands, like, I sometimes can't help but laugh. Because whenever I think about McDonald, like, whenever I think of the word McDonald, like, the first thing that pops into my mind is the McDonald's restaurant. Like, no offense to people who live out in McDonald Islands, but I always, like, think of McDonald's whenever I hear the word McDonald's. So, yeah. So yeah, that's interesting on how there's a part in Australia called McDonald Islands. That's very interesting.
John Heard discovered the Heard Island in 1853, while fellow American William McDonald discovered the McDonald Islands.
Oh, okay. So the Heard Island, that was named after somebody with the last name Heard, and the McDonald Islands was named after somebody with the last name McDonald. So that's interesting. That's basically how they got their names. That's pretty interesting.
Following you. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe and like for more, and I will see you next time on Council of Knowledge.
So, yeah, that was a pretty interesting video. I definitely learned quite a bit. And I definitely learned a lot about how the Australian states and territories got their names. And I even learned about some territories that I didn't even know existed. So that's interesting, actually. And it looks like, just like how Canada, and it's interesting, like, just like how Canada had its own flags for its territories and provinces, Australia seems to have its own flags for its own territories and, states. So that's interesting. And it's interesting on how Australia uses states instead of provinces, because in Canada, we have provinces and territories. We actually never really use the word states here in Canada. It's always provinces and territories. So it's interesting on how Australia uses states and territories to define certain parts of their land. So that's pretty interesting, actually, of how they actually use, like, both states and territories. And it's interesting on how both Canada and Australia both have territories, and it's interesting on how like one territory and it's interesting on how, like, I only saw like one territory of Australia, not knowing that there were multiple other territories of Australia that I never even knew existed. So yeah. But anyways, I think with all that being said, I think I'm going to end off this video. If you guys happen to enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button, and also don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any other things that you want me to react to and learn about in Australia, leave it down in the comments below. And until then, I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!